it's Allison Martino from Vintage Los Angeles, and you're listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. I'm Tom Guild. Today, we'll cross the international date line and head to Australia, where we will talk with architect and 2002 Pritkzer Prize winner Glenn Murcutt. From the UK, we've got architecture critic Rowan Moore. And wrapping up, we'll meet the author of Modern Chinese Architecture, 180 Years. Her name is Nancy Steinhardt. And now from Raleigh, North Carolina, you know, where Barney went to party, here's your host, Mr. Modernism, George Smart.
Hey, thanks, Tom. I want to read you all a letter written in 1990. Here we go. If you have found this note, you must be engaged in demolishing one of the false columns that has been placed in the foyer of the Sainsbury wing. I believe that the false columns are a mistake of the architect, and that we would live to regret our accepting this detail of his design. Let it be known that one of the donors of this building is absolutely delighted that your generation has decided to dispense with the unnecessary columns. This letter was found as those columns were being destroyed in 2023 as part of a renovation to the Sainsbury wing of the National Gallery in London. John Sainsbury's family donated millions of pounds in the 1980s, and he hated that pillar,
I guess,
which was 100% decorative and didn't support anything except the postmodernist style designed by American architects Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown. Sainsbury thought it was an eyesore, and he placed the letter in the pillar. Sainsbury got the last word, but unfortunately he died in 2022 and didn't get the glory of gloating to see the letter surface. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by June Goldfinger and Jeff Taylor, sponsors of Circle, Square, Triangle, a traveling exhibition on the architecture of Myron Goldfinger, and by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Palm Springs, Malibu, Toronto, and Los Angeles.
Glenn Murcutt is the most famous architect in Australia, winning the Pritkzer Prize in 2002 and the only Australian to do so since. Murcutt has also won the 1992 Alvar Aalto Medal and the 2009 AIA Gold Medal, among many other awards. Born in London in 1936, he spent the first part of his life in Papua New Guinea before settling in Australia for a 1961 architecture degree from the University of New South Wales Technical College.
Go Lions!
Within a few years, he founded his own firm, and with a career spanning 7 decades, Glenn has taught in Australia, New Guinea, Finland, Denmark, and the United States. As you'll find out, his work is inspired by an Aboriginal phrase that essentially became his philosophy: touch the earth lightly, ensuring place-based, climate-conscious designs. And he also runs what some have called the world's best architecture summer camp for adults. Murcutt still draws by hand. He's not a computer guy. So George spoke with him via Zoom from his friend's cell phone.
Glenn, thank you so much for talking with me. I understand this is your first live podcast.
That is correct. Indeed it is.
Well, you never forget your first time, Glenn, so we're going to try to make it memorable for you. It's memorable for us because I can see you and you can see me. We're doing this through Zoom, and you're in a Mercedes doing this, which is fantastic.
Yes, well, it's better this way. We're in a very quiet place, parked adjacent to Sydney Harbour in a parkland where it's totally quiet and away from family and all the noises that families make. So
that's true.
At peace and be able to talk with you.
Well, I'm thrilled to talk with you. In doing the research for this interview, I have come to the determination that you are basically, Glenn, the Yoda of architecture for planet Earth. Now, let me tell you why. So you've been around for decades. You work alone. You're in a remote place. You're revered throughout the galaxy. You have a catchphrase, and people travel from all over to train with you. That's pretty much you're the Yoda.
Well, yes, that's largely true. One of the myths one has to be able to expose a little is that I do work with an engineer. I do
Okay.
have consultants, of course. They are consultants. They're not in my practice, of
Yes.
course. But I essentially don't employ people. I prefer to work in collaboration, and that I've done over the years with Wendy Lewin and Reg Lark and a number of other people, and work as a team. And that's the way I expand my practice. At the moment, I'm working with a wonderful younger architect, Angelo Candelepis, here in Sydney, and that allows me to be able to do larger scale work. So I'm doing a couple of very large projects for me at the moment with Angelo, but on the other hand, I go back to my practice, which is in a very isolated place, no staff, no photographs up on the wall of work I've done. I just sit there quietly and work away in a very concentrated way.
Well, you've certainly accomplished so much. I was looking at all the designations that you have, all the letters after your name by different societies and so forth. And it's an alphabet soup. There are like 15 of them or so. I looked up your Pritkzer Prize ceremony, which was in Rome, I believe.
Yeah.
And on that committee was Ada Louise Huxtable. She was still around then.
Ada was wonderful. I also received another wonderful thing from the United States. They put me beside Ada for the event, and I had a lovely evening with Ada. She was wonderful, but was quite feared by many. But I had a most marvelous association with her.
Well, let's go back in time. You were born in London, right, when your parents were on the way to the Berlin Olympics? Do I have that correct?
Yes, you do.
Okay. And then you moved to New Guinea?
Yep. But my father had been in New Guinea already since about 1919. And there he did carpentry work. And then he linked up with Errol Flynn, who you know is the actor.
Oh,
Errol
sure.
Flynn.
The swashbuckling actor.
Yes. And Errol, of course, is an Australian, born in Tasmania.
I did not know that.
Well, a lot of Americans don't know lots of things.
True.
And let me say that when they linked up, Flynn wanted to become an actor. He said to my father, "Look, you're in the building industry. Why don't we build a yacht? I'll put up the money for the yacht. You build it, and we'll sail to America." And that's what they did. And so my father built the yacht. It was launched. It sailed very well, and came back into Port Moresby Harbour. And unfortunately, Flynn was not that popular in New Guinea. He owed so many people money, and they weren't going to let him escape. They knew what was happening, and they sank the boat.
Oh.
The boat is at the bottom of Port Moresby Harbour today. And when I was 50 years of age, I was teaching in New Guinea, and I spoke to the Commodore of the yacht club and told him the story. And he said, "Do you remember what the boat looked like?" And I said, "Well, of course, I wasn't born, but I have photographs and I know what it looked like, so I drew it for him." And he said, "I know exactly where that boat is, down at the bottom of the harbour. It's still down there at the bottom. It's just full of barnacles, and it's a wonderful sight for the fish." So that's where it stayed. And Flynn escaped New Guinea, and he left a trail of destruction almost wherever he went. It was in terms of financial loss to lots of people.
As swashbucklers do, I guess, right? They're not known for their financial prowess.
Certainly not.
The first house that I could find that you designed was the Simpson Lee House in Urunga. Is that right?
No, the first house I designed was when I was at university.
Okay.
And that was in 1961 for an Olympic swimmer, John Devitt. I was in the swimming world, and I had a lot of friends that were very, very wonderful swimmers. John Devitt won the gold medal in the Olympics for the 100 metres. And John and his wife, Wendy, were friends of mine. We were in the same swimming club, and I was in my final year in architecture, and he said, would you design me a house? So I said, yes. And so that house actually hasn't been published, but it has many of the principles that I followed through in my career.
Well, of course, the most famous principle that you talk about all the time is touch the earth lightly. How did you come to describe it that way?
I was at a national award ceremony, and a man from Western Australia, Ryan Clopper, came to me and he said, I have to let you know that there is a great Aboriginal saying, and that is, we have survived through touching the earth lightly. And I have identified this quote as coming from Brian, but it's actually an Aboriginal statement, is to touch the earth lightly. You know, the Aboriginal people have been here maybe 60,000 years, and their life was structured not through survival of the fittest, but survival through cooperation. And it's a very different way of thinking, to survive through cooperation.
Oh, yes.
And that has been the Aboriginal way. And it's why when Europeans came here, the landscape was changed by the fire stick technology, but it was nevertheless an authentic landscape of native plants. And the fire stick technology changed the structure of those plants, about the ones that could survive through fire and the others that couldn't survive through fire. And the areas where there was a higher rainfall, of course, our rainforests developed. And on the east coast of Australia, we have an incredible number of rainforests that have high complexity in their flora, which is just wonderful. So the actual statement, touch the earth lightly, has to be attributed to an Aboriginal statement, and it's about survival, using resources wisely. That's something that was very consistent with my upbringing about using resources wisely. In fact, a friend of mine said, I understand, knowing you for many years, the influence of your father was absolutely extraordinary. And you're very interested in the economics of building, and that's not necessarily cheap. I'm talking about using materials wisely, the economics of use of materials, how you can reuse those materials when changes are made. But he said, I remember you telling me your father's whole attitude towards economy. And during breakfast, we had the alternative of either eggs or porridge. But you know what he did? He boiled the eggs in the porridge to save power, so that you wouldn't have to boil eggs separately and make porridge separately. So he washed the eggs, cleaned them on the outside, and put the eggs into the porridge and cooked the eggs. So we had eggs and porridge all in the one thing, took the eggs out, cracked them open, and the egg was cooked. So that sort of way of thinking about how can two things be done in one job.
I understand that you have a sort of secret, exclusive summer camp for architects to come and study with you that's just heralded the world over. People just want to make the pilgrimage to come spend a few weeks with you and study. What is that program all about, and how often do you do it?
We have done it for the last 22 years. Annually, it has been to this point. Most of that period until COVID was for an immersion of 15 days. They're not students, but they're all architects that are feeling a little bit tired and want the batteries recharged. And I have associated with me wonderful architects like Richard Leplastria, Brett Anderson, Peter Stutchbury, and Lindsay Johnston. And we put this together, and we have something like 60 nationalities, or maybe even more.
Oh, yes.
From abroad who spend this up to 2 weeks with us. We have taken that back to 11 days because we've found that 11 days can just fit in what we want to achieve with a group of people who come. They're a marvelous group of people because they're totally committed. And it's wonderful to be working with up to 35 architects who are totally committed to doing a project, and they work in collaboration. We make it very clear from the outset that there are different age and different experiences coming. Different people have different levels of experience in the profession. Some are bosses, some are employed. And so we make sure that the bosses don't go into a group and they've got to come back and be part of the group. We are about achieving education through collaboration without one of the people going ahead and driving it every one of the others. That we've got to make certain from the outset that each of them is contributing in a very equal way. So they learn about equality. And what is extraordinary is we've had some groups, people have come that have been bosses, then have all of a sudden started to take over. And we've had to pull them aside and be able to say to them, look, this is not a practice. This is not an office. This is a way of collaborating equally. And would you believe several of them that have practices of 30 and 40 people have gone back and restructured their practice. A young architect was in a very good practice, developing his own practice in a commercial way. He was only in his late 30s. After our program, he went back to Slovenia and he restructured his practice. No longer is he going to do any of that work that he was doing. He finished it all off. And today, he's probably one of the best young designers for smaller scale work in Slovenia and doing some beautiful work. It's a sort of opening up possibilities beyond that which they've practiced over the years.
This sounds as much personal growth as architecture, really.
It is what it's about, is to be able to bring out in each of them abilities that take them further on. And those lacking in confidence, they gain confidence as a consequence of the sharing.
Well, I guess I have reason number 7 now that you're Yoda because of the way you described this. This is like you're training young Jedi for the future.
Well, I also have been teaching at the University of New South Wales. I taught at Sydney University for many years, and I always wanted to run a program whereby I also did a very similar approach at universities, and then I take students away out of their environment into a landscape that is so gentle. One has to be very, very conscious of how one impacts that landscape. Looking at water table, looking at wind patterns, looking at patterns on the ground of movement of animals, looking at the type of flora. You can tell by the flora the type of ground condition it is. You can tell by the height of the flora, by the depth of the soil. You can tell by the flora whether it's a water table level, whether it's like the Melaleucas, there's going to be a high moisture content in the ground. And these are the sort of things about where you can build, where you should not build, and where it may be appropriate to build and design appropriately. That's what, to me, is so important, is the ability to be able to understand the site and to be able to design something that is appropriate. This is not about novelty. This is not about buildings that twist and turn and lean. I mean, frankly, where are we in this profession when today we can have buildings that defy gravity? It's just, frankly, nonsense. And that's why my background is very much based on the mid-century of architecture, of the case study houses of your country. I was raised with that. I was raised with Neutra. I was raised with Mies. I was raised with Johnson. I was raised with the Weiss brothers. I know anything about your American architects. And I've spent time in America. And I've been teaching in Seattle. I taught at Yale. I've taught in UCLA and Berkeley. They're wonderful places to be. But every time I'm working there, I'm dealing with landscape.
The importance of place, of course, can't be understated. What are some of the places that architects tend to want to build that they should really leave alone or treat differently?
Well, of course, building in any native landscape, one has to be extremely careful. I'm not advocating you don't build. I'm saying what I advocate is be careful. For example, lighthouses in my country and your country are built in very prominent sites.
Yes.
Today, to build any building on those sites would be impossible. But some of those lighthouses are so beautiful, they actually contribute to the landscape. So to a beautiful landscape, it is possible to contribute to it. And many of those lighthouses do contribute in a most positive way. And today, you would not be able to demolish them. whereas you could not build them either.
Yes. They're a whole special category of their own.
Yes, indeed. But that is an example of architecture that is so well done and it's so beautiful that many of them contribute to their place. And I think that they're the examples that we humans can do things in most sensitive places beautifully, but it requires a high level of sensitivity, and that is not something that's common in our profession.
When you look around at buildings around the world, which ones do you think have really honored that sense of place and treading lightly on their site?
Well, remember, treading lightly has got to be very carefully understood. It's not about putting 4 columns down and being suspended over the ground.
Right.
It can be that, but it is looking at where does the material come from? What was the energy production cost for that material? Can the building be changed without a whole lot of loss of material? Instead of being demolished, they can be used and reused. But how do we reuse the material that we demolish? Therefore, we must put together buildings in a way that can be pulled apart without loss of the material. So bolting, screws, and things like that are the ways that buildings can work very well. But there are many buildings in the world. The work of Mies, the work of Wright, the work of Breuer, Gropius. There are so many. In Britain, I loved the work of Sir Leslie Martin in King's College in Cambridge. You look at the cathedrals in the world. Look at Chartres. Look, all these buildings. There are so many that are the most wonderful examples of buildings that are, and let me say, I don't use the word sustainable because to use it implies that everything is unsustainable and most things are unsustainable. The reality is sustainability is one part of our responsibility in designing our work. Rather than sustainable is part of architecture that's responsible. To find and pull out one thing is inappropriate, whereas to be able to have a level of responsibility includes sustainability, which includes how things are put together to be able to pull apart.
How is Australia doing with preservation? Because in America, it seems like we're tearing down everything and rebuilding something new.
Yeah. Look, my view is if you tear something down, you make sure what you're rebuilding is better than what you tore down. But that almost never happens. We do have some teeth in preservation. For example, I've been invited and accepted that some of my work is now being listed by the state in the heritage.
Yes.
And that's pretty much a security about the future of the building. I did a building in 1975. The family, the husband and wife divorced, and they sold the house. And the next owner came in and did some terrible things to it. Terrible.
Yes, that happens.
Yeah. But then a third owner came in, and the beautiful thing is that the third owner had a younger architect, a very good younger architect, about to design a house for this client. He saw this house was up for sale and he said to his client, let's go and have a look at the house. So they went and looked at it and they couldn't believe what they were seeing. And young Matthew said, look, Darryl, why don't you think about buying it? And Darryl said, I'm not going to think about it. I'm going to buy it. Matthew said, yeah, I'm doing myself out of a new job. But he said, I'd be very happy to do the restoration. And so all my drawings, I didn't realize it, but all my drawings are with the State Library of New South Wales. Pretty well, I think all but 3 or 4 drawings I've ever done in my life are held at the State Library. And it was announced the other night at the launch of the new book on my unbuilt work that there are about 100,000 drawings of mine in the State Library. And being accessible allows young architects like Matthew to go and look at those and see what the house was and be able to appropriately restore it. That, to me, is a wonderful way of preserving a building. And when it goes into a listing in the state heritage, then it has some teeth.
Is the State Library in Sydney or Canberra?
It's in Sydney.
It's in Sydney. Okay.
Canberra is in Capital Territory, the capital of the country, and they have a very significant library there as well. But Sydney Library is developing the most marvellous collection of architects' drawings going back into the 1800s.
One of the buildings that I love to see and haven't visited yet is the State Capitol building in Canberra, which is now, I think, about 30 years old and one of the few modern capitals in the world.
Yes, that's probably right. Aldo Jurgler, Mitchell Jurgler Thorpe were the architects for the Parliament House, which you're referring to.
Yes.
And I got to know Aldo Jurgler very well. He was a marvellous man, a real human. And, you know, we used to have lunch together. And he put me up for the American AIA.
The fellowship.
Fellowship, yes. And at one lunch day, he said, "Would you send me your CV?" And I said, "I don't have a CV." And he said, "What? That's ridiculous. We're going to meet again. I'll meet you. I'll be back here next week. We'll meet." And we did. And do you know what? He wrote up my CV, went back to Canberra, typed it up, and sent me my CV. That was Aldo. He did it personally.
Wow.
He was such a lovely man, such a human. I just loved him. He was so generous. And he did produce an amazing work in Australia. And we loved him as a fellow Australian. You know, he became an Australian. And do you know why he became an Australian?
Why?
He said, my wife, who I think she had dementia, he said, in a society that looks after its old, that cares for their old, in the medical system, it is just a real society. This is a humane society. He just loved our country. And of course, we all pay a certain sum of money,
Yes,
relative to our income, into a national medical system. That gives us the chance of still seeing our same doctor that we want. All those sorts of things are available to us. And the society looked after his wife in medical terms and in physical terms. And he said, that's why I'm going to become an Australian citizen. This is a civilized society.
Well, let's talk about your new book.
Oh, yes.
It's called Unbuilt Works by Timson Hudson. Beautiful book.
Yep.
I did notice, though, it includes some built works as well as the unbuilt ones.
Yes, the author decided to show just a few drawings, a few photographs to actually look at influences. What he's aiming at was showing that my work is actually building upon what my knowledge is of my other work. In other words, I'm not looking at magazines. I'm not jumping from one thing to another. I'm not wanting to be different for the sake of difference, which I really dislike. You know, we go to Paris. We go down the Rue de Seine, for example. We don't look at the buildings, but we feel the space.
Yes.
We feel the space that the buildings define. We're not there looking at every individual building. So there's a continuity. It's the beauty of that continuity of space and form. And to be able to look at the typology, the materiality, the morphology, these are the sort of things that really matter, not about a building seeking attention. I love buildings that I go past and I think as I go past, oh, I must go back and look at that again. And I go back and it starts to reveal itself. Buildings that reveal themselves are really important to me, not buildings that show, that jump at you and are screaming at you to be looked at.
Yes.
I dislike them intensely, whereas I love buildings that are so good, but they're quiet, and there's beauty in the quietness of it all. And resolution is just wonderful. I have the greatest admiration for architects who produce beautiful work that will be beautiful work in 100 years' time.
I'm feeling, Glenn, I'm feeling the force going through me right now, just listening to you talk. I can see how the people that come and study with you are getting inspired.
And that's nice. Thank you.
The quote in the front of your new book says, "My role is not that of a creator. My role is that of a discoverer. I spend my time with hundreds of drawings, looking at the possibilities. They're all about discovery." that kind of unfolding for you is so critical?
It is a really important issue for me. I discovered that I wasn't creating anything. As an architect, I don't create a thing. What I do is I experiment. I'm all the time drawing, discovering. And this is one of the great issues of today, where discovery has becoming lost to the computer, where the computer has got a mind of its own. You know, when we had boards and T-squares, we developed them to design our building, to actually work our buildings the way we think. Today, the computer is able to do some silly things, absolutely silly things. And we're seeing some of the silliest things occurring in the world today in architecture that are, in my view, totally irrelevant, that they're not even experimental. Experimental work can be very good. I mean, I think Privet did quite a lot of experimental work. I think the experimental work coming out of discovery is very important. And I love the idea of discovery because what it does, it destroys ego. It takes away the elite aspect of the potential of architecture that can be incredibly elitist. I love the idea that it's available, discovery is available to all of us. And the creative aspect to our lives is about the method only through which we discover. And I love the idea that discovery is open to all of us. There's no hierarchy to it. It is what it is. You're searching, you're discovering, and I love that idea. And when you go discovering, you find things, and you find things you never realized. And the other thing is this. I think in discovery, when the mind is working in discovery, what happens is that the subconscious is working incredibly hard. And I look at some of the work and the solutions, and I think, how the hell did that happen? I have no idea. I have no idea. And it's a little bit like, and I used to play classical music until I started studying architecture. And there are some times when you're playing and you don't have the score in front of you, your mind loses it. But your hand takes over. The muscles of the hand and the fingers know where to go. And all of a sudden your mind comes back because the fingers are telling where you're at. And having experienced that, I realize that the whole process of drawing is an extension of your brain. And you should all read the wonderful book by my very close friend, Johannes Pallasma, The Thinking Hand. You'll learn from that about the neurosciences of thinking through the hand. And the fact that we're not using our hand any longer in the way we have done. And by the way, they're researching this now, and they're finding that writing words is so important to remembering it, as opposed to typing it. The memory isn't being developed in the same way. We're losing that level of understanding. And I think that's a really important research that's going on here in this country.
The new book is Glenn Murcutt, Unbuilt Works by Nick Sissons. Glenn, may the force be with you, my friend.
Thank you, George, very much.
That was Australia's Glenn Murcutt. Since 2010, Rowan Moore has served as the architecture critic for The Observer in London. The son of a politician and a journalist, wonder what that home life was like. Moore attended Westminster School and studied architecture at St. John's College at the University of Cambridge.
Go Blues!
Although he briefly practiced as an architect, he's best known as an architecture critic. Rowan served as director of the Architecture Foundation, editor of the architectural journal Blueprint, architecture editor for the Evening Standard, and a writer for The Guardian before he joined The Observer. In 2014, he was named Critic of the Year at the British Press Awards. Here's George's conversation with Rowan Moore.
Rowan, let's start with something about the urban environment versus architecture. Why is it that the United Kingdom is so much better than the United States in terms of public transportation? I mean, your country can build an additional subway line. It seems very easily. You're throwing one here, you're throwing one there, your trains all connect everywhere. It takes us 20 years to even decide to do that.
I think it doesn't look quite so rosy from over here. So we did build the Elizabeth line recently in London, which is a very wonderful facility and quite beautifully designed on the whole. High-speed, underground, extra-large train. However, it took decades, possibly over a century, from when it was first conceived to actually being built. And the first time somebody had an idea a bit like that was actually in the 19th century. When they actually started seriously planning the thing that became the Elizabeth line was, I think, in the early 70s. So I wouldn't say it's a triumph of expeditious decision-making, and other countries certainly do it a whole lot better. But we did at least get it built, and it is very handsome. And of course, it was very late, over budget, all these things.
Of course,
But
everything is, right?
pretty transformative now, yeah.
In the UK, the trains actually connect to the airports, something almost unheard of in the United States. I mean, even at minor London airports like Stansted and Luton, you can get on a train and come into London.
Yeah.
You can't do that, really, in a lot of places.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of quite refreshing to hear my country described like this because it doesn't always, Stansted's good, yeah. Luton's fairly less so. Heathrow's okay.
And you've got London City Airport still going too, right?
Yeah, that's a good one. That's really nice. I mean, there's not many flights go from there, but it's really easy, yeah. But on the other hand, I don't know if you've heard about our high-speed 2 rail line.
No.
Which was supposed to go from London to the north of England. And the government that just left office just axed it. And now they just spent £2 billion making it smaller than it was going to be. And now it gets you to Birmingham, which is probably like an hour and a half by the trains we've already got. So maybe you can get there in an hour, but that's really no big deal. That's a monumental fiasco, basically.
Well, we have the California high-speed rail system, which is billions and billions and billions of dollars. So we have our headaches too. But I just wanted to give a hat tip here to your country's connection with infrastructure because it's great.
Well, I think if you look at sort of Thailand, Japan, there's a whole lot of countries that do it better than we do. But anyway, I'll take the compliment.
You started off as a student of architecture.
I did.
Where was that?
I was at the University of Cambridge studying architecture.
Did you graduate and go to work for a firm?
I graduated. I went to work for a firm. I designed a little extension to somebody's house off my own bat. I also started writing from the time I was a student. So for quite a while, I was writing and practicing side by side. I set up an architectural practice with a friend of mine. I did that for 4 years. And then the chance came along to edit Blueprint magazine. And I thought, well, I've got to sort of jump one way or another. I can't be an editor and an architect at the same time. Even though, of course, Gio Ponti did that extremely well. But I'm really a words person, so I will become an editor. So that's what I did. So that's the point at which I stopped practicing architecture.
Blueprint magazine was a real success story. It was around in print for 37 years, right?
Yes.
And what was the focus of the magazine?
Blueprint started in the early 80s, and it was architecture and design. And it was really trying to take on the sort of fusty style that the kind of older architectural magazines had sort of fallen into. It was somewhat influenced by kind of the lifestyle magazines from the 70s. It was big format, lots of color, and it always had a photograph of an architect or designer on the front cover, which was more or less unheard of until that point. Until then, you always had pictures of buildings on the front. It was quite 80s. It was quite sort of shoulder paddy and, garish, overstated. That was the creation of Dejan Sujic as the editor and Peter Murray, the publisher. They were one of the first magazines to publish my articles, so I had a connection with them. And yeah, it was great to write for them. And I did enjoy the sort of slightly overstated style, but they allowed you to be, serious as well and, make serious points. And then I became the editor in 1994. I actually moved it somewhat away from the kind of glossiness and glitziness. I varied the cover a bit so it wasn't always somebody's face. When it was somebody's face, it was a bit more often a woman than had previously been the case.
Oh, well done.
I hadn't been very good at that. I tried to introduce a new style of photography. So the old style was, photographer gets up at 4:30 a.m, nobody around, bright blue skies, really crisp shadows. I mean, very powerful and beautiful, but just felt it was time for something different. So I kind of favored photographers who showed things that were more as lived, and maybe it was raining sometimes, and so a bit less kind of propagandistic, if you like.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I had different preferences of the architects I talked about. So the blueprint of the 80s was pretty closely associated with British high tech, Norman Foster, Richard Rogers, Nick Grimshaw, and that all went with the style and the photography and that sort of dazzle.
Let me ask you, as an architecture critic, and I'm sure you've written on this many times, if a building is constructed and it's completely different than its buildings around it, versus a building that has somehow been matched to its surroundings, how do you decide which one of those works?
There are absolutely no rules, except you just have to take account of what's around you. I very strongly believe that you don't experience buildings on their own. If you go into a town square in a beautiful city, that is made up of all the buildings around it, not one building. Even if a building is in the desert, it still has the context of the desert and of the climate. So somehow or another, an architect needs to take account of what is there and create a relationship with it. And that relationship can be any kind of dialogue. It can be contradictory. It can be friendly. Yeah, there's no rules, but there has to be a conversation of some sort.
I agree with you, but it seems like that the buildings that don't match anything are the ones that get the most fame and publicity, and 20 years later, people love them. Why is that?
Well, there's always a premium or a kind of reward for making a big noise. And I guess some of those noisier buildings, they manage to make their own context over time. Mm-hmm. Well, people just accept them. They become part of everyone's kind of mental furniture. And I guess whatever's around them has to sort of accept their presence. But I still think that the best buildings, even if they're extremely spectacular, have a relationship to what's around them. I mean, if you take Frank Gehry's Bilbao Guggenheim, mm-hmm. which was obviously a kind of early iteration of what was called iconic architecture, which I was a big supporter of when it was built, and I sort of wrote some of the first articles about it in Britain before it was built even, and you could see it was going to be a big thing. That certainly fueled this wave of iconic architecture where buildings could be any shape. They tried to look as outlandish as possible. But the Bilbao Guggenheim is an extremely contextual building. It really relates to what's around it. So it's in the city of Bilbao, which is a predominantly 19th century, once a shipbuilding city in northern Spain, in the Basque country. And on one side, it's got the river. On another side, it's got these apartment blocks. It's got this fairly amazing bridge flying over to one side. You've got sort of changes in the topography, so the land rises up on the other side of the river. So it's kind of like the apartment buildings and boats and landscape and the bridge kind of mashed together and rearranged to talk to each other again, with a big dose of kind of just geariness chucked in as well. And that's what I think is really great about that building. Whereas, certainly there are other iconic buildings that I don't think will ever be as good, just because all they are is a funny shape, and I'm not very interested in that kind of architecture.
As a critic, do you ever find a building that's just so bad you don't want to write about it?
Well, there is a certain pleasure in, I'm afraid to say, as a critic, in criticizing. Doing a good takedown is quite a satisfying thing. But there's no fun in taking something down that's just a bit uninteresting. And the ones that deserve taking down are the ones where there's a high level of pretension, mm-hmm. or where a fantastic opportunity has been missed, or it's sort of incredibly wasteful in some way, where the architect has really, for reasons of ego or something else, has really messed things up. If there's a kind of building out there somewhere that's just not very good, yeah, I'd rather not talk about that because you're just, you're just being kind of mean for, who cares that much. I also think it's valid to criticize buildings as a class. So if you have, well, in this country, as in all countries, an awful lot of new housing is just really mediocre. There's not much point picking out one of those houses, except possibly as an exemplar of the whole class. But it's certainly worth talking about what's wrong with the whole typology. The hardest part of my job is you go along and you see a building. It's been a big part of an awful lot of people's lives, the architects, the builders, the other consultants, the clients. You go and see it, they show you around, they're perfectly decent people. I put a whole lot less of my life into writing about it than they have put into it. And then I go, yeah, it's not that good, really.
Right.
I've never really known how to deal with that satisfactorily. I'm not trying to be a lawgiver. I'm not trying to sort of give the last word on anything. I see myself as giving an opinion that's an informed opinion, which I would hope people would pay some attention to. But if anyone says, well, he's got that wrong, then that's totally fine by me.
You've been writing for a long time. Have any of the things that you've written about that you've wished would happen actually come true?
Well, I guess things come and go. My first article was 1983, I think. Then I was writing through the 80s, and the big thing then was Prince Charles, as he was then, sounding off about architecture. And there's this really...
He was very public about that.
He certainly was. And he had a huge influence. Yeah, so he made all these attacks on modernist architecture and in favor of traditionalist architecture, and he kind of helped to promote a certain kind of neo-traditionalist architecture. And I found that really frustrating. Didn't actually consider myself a modernist. And when I was at architecture school, modernist was a bit of a boo word. There was a big multi-layered criticism of modernism, some of which was justified and some of which was not. So I do not consider myself at that point as a sort of proselytizer for modernism. However, it was really obvious that the way to go from there was not wind the clock back to 1890 or wherever you might think was the last time someone did a good building. So I found Prince Charles's interventions really simplistic. And in fact, the more he made these attacks, the more I kind of liked modernism.
Yeah, he and a fellow named Roger Scruton were very well publicized at the time for disliking.
He was another part of that gang, who I also find infuriating. During the 80s, I had to put quite a lot of energy into sort of making the case for modern architecture in a broad sense, not specifically modern movement, but architecture that in some way was of its time. And that seemed like a bit of a hopeless struggle, but by the 90s, people were beginning to say, oh, okay, yeah, there's such a thing as a good modern building. And I guess towards the end of the 90s, you had Tony Blair coming into power in Britain. There was a kind of feeling of optimism about the future that there had not been before. And there were a few seminal buildings that when the general public looked at them, went, oh, yeah, I quite like that. I felt a little bit of kind of vindication, or I felt I'd been part of something positive. Then in the early 90s, as I was saying at Blueprint, supported a kind of architecture that wasn't very well understood in Britain. And that became more assimilated, became more part of the mainstream. And you never, ever know as a critic when you've actually had an effect on something.
Right.
There's maybe sort of 3 or 4 occasions when I say, okay, I definitely know. And then I haven't always felt all that good about it. One occasion was a developer called Irvine Seller proposed this very tall tower above London Bridge Station in London. I wrote an article in the Evening Standard, which was a London paper that I was writing for at that time. I think I called it a poke in the eye with a sharp stick. And I said, if you're going to build a building this prominent, this conspicuous, at least get a decent architect to do it. Because in my opinion, they hadn't chosen a decent architect to do it. And that, by the way, is a case where I think a takedown is entirely justified because that's an extremely prominent, conspicuous building. Anyway, so they went away and hired Renzo Piano, and that became the Shard.
Oh, wow.
I had an influence there.
Thank you very much, sir.
You're most welcome.
Now, your new book is called Property, The Myth That Built the World.
Yeah.
And it talks about how property shapes the modern world and how there's some good to that and some danger from that as well.
Mm-hmm.
My first question is, when did we start having private property? When did it become less communal and more that just average people could own it?
Well, I mean, the ancient Romans had an idea of private property, but there was this particular kind of transition in Europe and Britain especially from the kind of late Middle Ages gathering speed all through to the 18th and 19th centuries, when common land was enclosed, ways of using land that were communal were basically privatized and taken over by big landowners, which was a procedure that was then exported to colonies in the United States and Australia. And then that concept was kind of codified, if you like, in the 17th century by especially the philosopher John Locke. So it's not like the idea of private property has never existed, but the idea that we have now has achieved a dominance over recent centuries that it didn't have before. And it's an incredibly powerful idea, and often it's very positive in its effects. But the point I tried to make in the book is it's not the only way of inhabiting, using land. And what we've seen recently is some of the kind of negative effects of that. The book was motivated by a few things. Very often when I write about buildings, I discover that behind the architecture story, there's a property story. In other words, an awful lot of the important decisions have been made before the architect is appointed. And they're made by who owns the land, what they want to get out of it in terms of profit and floor space. Is it speculative? Are they looking for a quick return? Are they looking for a longer return? Is it for an end user who's going to occupy it? The other big motivation is that I've lived my whole adult life in what Margaret Thatcher called the property owning democracy, which was the idea that as many people as possible should own their own home, and that would make them kind of happy and rich and free, and it would make them into better citizens. And I've seen the positive effects of it, but I've also seen the negative effects, which is, as in many American cities, properties become so expensive that it's out of reach of large number of people, especially younger people, and it's become this kind of generational divider. So that prompted me to look at, what other ways have people had of occupying land and building on land? Various forms of cooperative living, communal living, and also public housing. I mean, it's quite amazing that the idea didn't really exist until, 150, 160 years ago. And now it's a very large part of the housing stock in the world, which for sure has its problems and its failures, but also it plays a pretty important role in making cities and creating places for people to live. My book is kind of really a journey through the idea of private property. It's different manifestations. I pick out particular telling examples, and then I try and sort of describe what a kind of ideal might be of how to build a place.
As you were saying, the prices on some of these properties are just insane, even in places where you think it might not be that expensive.
Yeah.
Before the interview, you and I were talking about the case out in California, where a couple bought a Craig Elwood house for $12 million.
Yeah.
And then just scraped it and are going to build some brand new thing on top of it. What did you think when you heard this story?
But I thought it was atrocious. It's heartbreaking. I mean, it's not your usual couple, is it? Who, when you say a couple.
Yes.
Well, I mean, it's just terrible when a building like that gets destroyed. And I think property values play a role in that, because you know better than I would. But I imagine when Craig Elwood built that house, it was a middle-class house. They weren't the poorest people. I imagine they had a bit of money to spend, but it wasn't kind of outlandishly expensive. And if the land values go up so much that the building and the plot are worth $12 million or whatever it was, then it becomes more likely that that kind of buyer is going to want to spend as lavishly on the house as they have on the land. And that possibly means that a kind of thoughtful mid-century modern house doesn't suit their ambitions in the same way. I'd say that's kind of collateral damage of high property values, among some other things.
What surprises me is why people don't choose the renovation and addition route more frequently.
Yeah.
To preserve what's there, change it, add on to it, make it better,
Yeah.
versus tearing it all out. Particularly, not only is it going to be less expensive, but you're protecting the environment from the carbon release, I guess, of redoing a whole new building.
Well, those kind of buyers probably don't hugely care about either the most economic option or the most environmental option.
That can happen too, yeah.
I mean, what's a shame is they don't see the value of that kind of architecture in all senses of the word value. I mean, you do get, in Britain, there's this estate agent called Modern House, real estate agent. Their business is selling well-designed modern houses because people want that. There's a bit of a cachet to it. And it's a shame these kind of buyers can't be proud of having a Craig Elwood house. Or if they want their kind of mansion, they can't just find another bit of land somewhere else. But your point about the environmental consequences of demolition are really important, and something good that has happened in the conversation in recent years has been an appreciation of that by at least some architects and people in the construction industry. There's a hell of a lot of carbon embodied in existing buildings. I mean, until recently, you did have this obviously wrong phenomenon where a developer would come along and they would look at a building and they'd say, okay, we're going to build a new green building whose environmental performance is going to be better than the old building. And that would be true. But in order to achieve that, they would knock down the old building and waste so much energy and chuck so much carbon into the air just through the act of demolition and rebuilding that the improved performance that they achieved was kind of irrelevant. It took a really long time to sink in that that's the case.
Rowan, I have really enjoyed talking with you. Your new book is Property, The Myth That Built the World, available at all fine bookstores around the planet.
Online and physical, yes.
Thanks so much for talking with me.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Nancy Steinhardt is professor of East Asian art and curator of Chinese art at the University of Pennsylvania, where she has taught since 1982. Nancy began studying Chinese at the age of 13 while attending the Mark Twain Summer Institute. Later, she got a Ph.D. at Harvard.
Go Crimson!
Her research focuses on the art, architecture, and archaeology of China, Korea, and Japan, from the 2nd through the 14th centuries. But of special interest to our listeners, her latest book is Modern Chinese Architecture, 180 Years, covering buildings up to 2020. Welcome to the show, Nancy.
Thank you.
Hey, Nancy, before we talk about your book, I had no idea that Mark Twain spoke Chinese and had a school to teach it. So what was that all about?
So I'm from St. Louis, and Mark Twain's name appears at places across the state of Missouri. And this was an enrichment summer school, and I guess most of the people probably came to study math and the hard sciences. And I decided to sign up for Chinese, and it definitely changed my life. I've pretty much never stopped studying Chinese since then.
It must have been a challenge at first to learn Chinese, or did it come naturally?
For me, it's always been all about the characters. I don't speak like a native speaker, but I read pretty fluently. And I loved writing characters then, and I still love reading characters.
So how was there a program even to study at this institute? That's very unusual. What was this, the 80s?
It's very unusual, and China was not open. My teacher was from Singapore, but somebody in St. Louis suburbs got the idea that Chinese could be taught to 13-year-olds, middle school kids. And now, of course, Chinese and Japanese are very common in high schools across the United States, and even in some middle schools. But yes, it changed my life, continues to change people's lives. When we began to get lots of students who had studied Chinese in high school at Penn, we added an additional year, five full years of language training, because people came in with so much background.
That was not the case 50 or so years ago. China was really a closed country, very different from what we know of today, where China's in the news all the time. They're sending people into space. They're actively a part of the Olympics. So tell our listeners about what China was like, say, in the 60s.
China in the 60s was whatever people read in newspapers. China was a threat, just like North Vietnam was a threat, and people who wanted to study China went to Taiwan. And that's what I did. But the first person I met from the People's Republic was someone who was teaching Chinese around the year 1971. And a few people were coming out and were getting into universities. I went to Canada to study Chinese during the summer of 1972 because I thought that might be a way to get to China faster.
Until 1972, it was almost impossible for Westerners and Americans especially to get into the People's Republic. It was still a closed society in many ways.
You know, Nixon opened China.
Yep.
And interestingly, one of the first things that happened after his visit was the exhibition of archaeological treasures that came from the People's Republic to Washington, D.C. And I went to see that when I was in high school.
Nancy, let's start and work backwards. So your book covers up to 2020.
Right.
What are the most exciting buildings in China in 2020?
The last building that I illustrate is a site that was reclaimed. It had been used as a factory. It's called the Shougang Industrial Park. And it had been used as a factory, and companies came in and took the landscape and parts of the buildings and turned it into a center for all kinds of contemporary endeavors, including AI. A lot of the AI companies use this space as their workspace. The training in an architecture school in China is almost indistinguishable from the training in the United States or any place in Europe or major cities in South America and most of Asia. What's different, I think, is that when somebody from infancy looks out the window or is babies sitting in a carriage looking out, what that child sees in China looks very different, especially if the child's growing up in the countryside. It looks very different from what that child sees in the United States. Chinese mountains are unique. The mountains in north central China look like no mountains I've ever seen anywhere in the world. And so on some level, I think a person's first visual images impact the way they see space.
Now, who designed that factory that you were telling me got renovated?
It is a group project. We don't use the term work units anymore, but they're groups of 10, 20, sometimes 100 architects with chief designers who get a vision and then everybody else puts it together.
Is work units a Chinese concept?
Beijing Municipal Institute of City Planning and Design and CCTN Architect Design Company. And this has been the same in China since the 1950s, when the groups were more like work units, government designated. These are private enterprises, but a private group in Beijing on some level is always working within government protocol.
Now, you mentioned Arab, and that's a European firm, is it not?
Yes, they have their name on the project, yes.
Okay. And typically, does China still engage international firms to be the lead?
Definitely. One of the reasons I think this book is useful is because so many firms all over the world bid in China, and China is very fair about this, and European firm has as much opportunity to get a commission in China as a Chinese one. So it's very common to have someone from a European firm like Arup or someone or some group from the US put in a joint bid with, say, in this case, 2 Chinese firms.
Yes. Tell me about more buildings. Let's keep working back from 2020. What are some of the ones that really excite you?
Some of the ones that really excite me are always going to be the buildings that have some element of the past in them. One of the things that I think distinguishes this book from the book that somebody else would write is that I have decades of deep knowledge of standing inside and looking at buildings and seeing buildings taken apart. So I'm always looking for something where pre-modern China becomes part of the building. There's something called the China Pavilion in Shanghai that takes the shape of a bracket set. It's an ingenious building. When you first look at it, you say, oh, that's really trite. It's a bracket set.
What is a bracket set?
Bracket set is a piece of wood that joins the side of a building to the roof. It holds up the roof underneath from the side to the top. The European closest equivalent might be a cantilever. It's made up of horizontal, vertical, and diagonal pieces.
Are you talking about a building like the CCTV building?
The CCTV building is in this book, but the building that I'm talking about, it's bright red, and red is the color of trim on a Chinese building. And it's not wooden, but it looks like it's wooden. And it starts as a small building and it expands outward in every direction like a bracket set can. Usually bracket sets expand only in two directions. That's one of my favorite buildings. Something else that I noticed just during my last trip to China, I was at a church in Shanghai that had been built when Shanghai was a treaty port, and so this would have been built around the 1880s. And in every way, it presents like a European church, and Europeans had come and designed it. But I had my telephoto lens looking along the roof of this building, and I saw the little brackets. I saw bracket sets, not functional, just decorative. And I had never seen this in a picture. And the book was already published, or I would have added this. What I'm always looking for, the buildings I find most interesting from any period, are the ones where somehow China is very present, even though the materials are contemporary and ecologically correct.
A melding of traditional Chinese design with modern day design. That's interesting.
Yes.
Nancy, let's go back to the CCTV building. That's a building that many Americans know and have seen published before.
That's the Chinese television network.
The Chinese television network. Tell us about that building and who designed it and how you talk about it in your book.
Yes, it's definitely Rem Koolhaas, and I don't even know that I would say it's a typical Koolhaas building because he's so creative and so diverse. But I would consider it his most important building in China. It anticipates what 3 years later will be twisted steel. And this is one of the materials and one of the ways to manipulate materials that you see globally, but that China has been embracing for more than the last 10 years. So he doesn't twist, he only turns. It's not one of China's tallest buildings, which is kind of interesting.
And the locals have a nickname for it, don't they?
Big Pants, yeah.
Big Pants, because it looks like a pair of pants.
So what buildings constructed since, 1840, would you say have changed architecture in China?
Wang Shu, Pritkzer Prize winning native Chinese architect trained in China. I have 5 or 6 buildings by him. He's my favorite Chinese architect.
What's his name?
Wang, W-A-N-G, is the family name. S-H-U is his first name. He designs around southeastern China near the city of Hangzhou. You see his buildings, Hangzhou, Ningbo. He very much embraces the Chinese tradition using modern materials and modern concepts of space. One of my favorite buildings by him is the History Museum in the city of Ningbo. He has a tea house outside of Hangzhou, very small tea house. One of the most exceptional buildings that stands in China is HSBC Bank in Shanghai that was built in the early 1920s by a British firm, and that's inside and outside spectacular. There's been some very interesting dormitory building and housing for people. Some of these buildings are designed by named architects who had studied abroad, and they're using very constricted space to do something interesting. the ones actually on the campus of Southeast University in Nanjing are some of my favorites.
Okay, great. Well, Nancy, thank you so much for being on the show. The book is Modern Chinese Architecture, 180 Years. Appreciate your joining us.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by June Goldfinger and Jeff Taylor, sponsors of Circle, Square, Triangle, a traveling exhibition on the architecture of Myron Goldfinger, and by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Palm Springs, and Malibu. Okay, Tom, I believe the exit sign has lit up.
Please check your receipts for any personal items, and when you get home, visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 23,000 significant modernist houses, and access 4.3 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl, with guest research by Kelly Policelli and Ryan Van Sickle. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I'll be back soon with another globe-trotting edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.